Welcome to Radio Who, What, Why. I'm Jeff Schechtman. If you're following or trying to follow the Trump-Russia story, no doubt your head is filled with dozens of threads. The Trump Tower meetings, the dossier, the names of countless Russians, mobsters and oligarchs and bankers, banks in Germany, in Moscow, Cyprus, in Moldavia, money laundering, real estate deals, hedge funds, indictments, bankruptcies, and a cast of characters orbiting Trump that feels more like the bar scene in the original Star Wars. How is it possible, then, to understand it all? Especially if, as Steve Bannon told Michael Wolff, it's all about following the money. We can all imagine some kind of huge whiteboard or bulletin board in Mueller's office, with arrows and pictures and bank logos, and lines and threads connecting them all together. Over the course of the past week, Who, What, Why has published a multi-part series entitled Deutsche Bank, a global bank for oligarchs, Americans, and Russians, by Martin Sheil, a retired branch chief of the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. His Who, What, Why series could easily be seen as part of a preamble or executive summary to the report that Mueller may ultimately deliver to Congress. It is my pleasure to be joined here by Martin Sheil to talk about this story. Deutsche Bank, a global bank for oligarchs, American and Russian. Martin Sheil, thanks so much for joining us on Radio Who, What, Why.
Thanks for having me, Jeff. It's a real pleasure and honor to be on your podcast.
I want to begin by talking a little bit about Deutsche Bank as the link that ties so many of these pieces together, and just a little bit about its history.
Yeah, well, Deutsche Bank is a huge bank. It's a global bank, but its headquarters are in Frankfurt, Germany. Its philosophy really is to, going all the way back into the 19th century, is to generate in foreign investment in Europe and surrounding countries and globally. It really made its first forays into the United States around 1998, and they took over a bank in New York called Bankers Trust, which is a well-known bank in New York financial circles. The marching orders of the bankers in New York was to generate revenues and generate fees. You know, they wanted to grow the bank quickly, and they wanted to grow the profits just as fast. So those are the marching orders, and so to do that in financial circles and banking circles, what that really means is that you have to take on risks. And so, of course, who is one of the riskiest investments you could take on if you're in New York in the late 90s? Donald J. Trump.
Before we get to Trump, how was the attitude, the business policy of Deutsche Bank fundamentally different from so many of the other international banks that were trying to grow during that period, whether it was banks like HSBC or BNP, foreign banks based in European countries that in fact didn't take the same path? What is it that the business decisions that Deutsche Bank made that set it on the road to the reason that we're talking about it today?
The object of the company was to transact banking business of all kinds, in particular to promote and facilitate trade relations between Germany, other European countries, and overseas markets. So that's basically what they decided to do. They decided to basically sprout their wings, spread their branches, and they did. And the timing was right for them. Several other European banks also did that, but what I think differentiates Deutsche Bank was they were in hot pursuit of earnings. They wanted to grow as quickly as they could, and they did. Their risk management, let's just say, wasn't very good. And something I wanted to point out as we get into Deutsche Bank, some of their philosophy was they didn't believe in autonomy as an instrument of management leadership. They were very centralized. Everything was directed from Frankfurt, from the top, and so their direction was go out make money, increase earnings, and they had very ambitious objectives there. And it was a big challenge for them because you have different cultures. You have the American culture, the New York financial scene, and then you have the UK was growing, and the financial climate there was really starting to percolate because you had the European Union just starting to grow, and then you had Russia coming out of the 90s, shedding the Soviet Union shackles, and you had capitalism just starting to take root there, but you had all sorts of things going on there too, because you had all these state-run enterprises which were now open to private enterprise and being sold for pennies on the dollar in terms of their value. And you had these predator plutocrats coming in and taking over and just milking it for all it was worth. They didn't really concern themselves very much with normal regulatory procedures, and they got themselves in a world of hurt with SEC and CFTC and with the U.S. Attorney's Office in Southern District of New York, with New York State financial folks. They got in trouble with United Kingdom's financial regulators, and it didn't seem to matter to these folks. I mean, they were taking on fines, multiple billions of dollars of fines for, toxic mortgage loans, for manipulation of the LIBOR, which is interest rate over in the UK. They were taking on, they were getting hit with millions of dollars of fines for not maintaining their anti-money laundering controls, and it just didn't seem to matter. It was just a cost of doing business. None of the management executives were ever had their feet held to the fire. They were never held accountable. The law in Germany does not allow really for the prosecution of the criminal prosecution of banking executives. No one in Germany, banking circles, has ever really gone to jail for any financial skullduggery.
Martin, talk a little bit about how Deutsche Bank continued to be impacted by the financial conditions of any given time, and how in some cases actual U.S. policy encouraged some of the nefarious practices of Deutsche Bank.
So in the middle of all of that, in the early 2000s, Deutsche Bank was, as we said, sunk their roots back in 1998 and started growing by leaps and bounds, taking on a huge risk in all areas. Their mortgage loans, their currency manipulations, pretty much any area that you can think of, they took on, a lot of risk and went the extra mile. They really pushed the boundaries, and they got themselves jammed up. The regulatory authorities, looking at them, would investigate and threaten to prosecute. And then what happened was that no one would actually individually would be held responsible, and the corporation would just get hit with a million or $1 billion fine. And that didn't inhibit anyone. They just kept going. It was the cost of doing business. The only ones that suffered from that type of approach would be the shareholder, the one who's investing in the bank. And these executives didn't care about the shareholders. They only cared about their own bonuses,
Focus a little bit on Deutsche Bank's connection to Russia and to Russians. They set up an office in Moscow. Talk a little bit about that connection.
Deutsche Bank had a close relation with a bank called VTB. I can't pronounce the Russian, Vnesh Bank or something like that. VTB is right now is probably the second largest bank over there. But Deutsche was looking to expand, and the timing was right because the Russian economy was starting to take off. The oligarchs had pretty much started to settle down. Putin had taken over. He became president in 2000, and he set about attempting to get their tax authorities stabilized. And it took a while because there was a lot of corruption there. But the oil prices started really increasing, and Russia is very much an oil-based economy. So there's a lot of money to be made over there, and the economy was flourishing. Folks were doing well. So Deutsche Bank was looking to cash in, and they got with VTB, and the head of VTB was a guy by the name of Andrei Kostin, who was alleged to be ex-KGB. And as Putin once famously said, there is no such thing as ex-KGB. Once KGB, always KGB. And the thing about Russian banks is that they're just dominated by KGB and FSB intelligence officers. FSB took over for KGB. Anyway, Kostin was the head of VTB, and very tight with Putin. Kostin, Deutsche approaches Kostin and says, "Look, we'd like to set up some offices here and expand and get Deutsche rolling. What do you think?" And Kostin said, "Yeah, let's work together." And says, "Hey, by the way, why don't you hire my son to head up the Deutsche Bank office here in Moscow?" So, okay, Deutsche agreed to do that, and Andrei Kostin became the head of Deutsche Bank Moscow. Well, he brought in some folks that were closely related to Kostin and to Putin, and to called FOB, Friends of Putin. Suddenly, revenues for Deutsche Bank just took off. They increased 200%, 300%, 400%, in a short period of time. This is about, the late 2000s, let's say 2006, 2007 area. And one of the things that was going on, a lot of the Russians who had made a lot of money were concerned. It was a little bit like the Wild West over there, in that, you had some corrupt authorities, and you had Russian organized crime was very prominent. And so folks who had made some money were concerned. They also didn't particularly like paying taxes, very similar to wealthy Americans and Europeans. And they were looking to move their money out of Russia. And so money laundering was a big deal over there. And I must say, having investigated money laundering for decades, the Russians are the best at it.
Explain why it was so important, given the state of the Russian economy. Why was it so important to move money out of the country? Why was money laundering such a critical business with respect to Russia?
These oligarchs, there's about, at the time, about 200 of them that really controlled most of the economy. I mean, they controlled 75-80% of the economy. And a lot of that is oil-related or mineral-related. They were concerned. They wanted to safeguard their money, and they were never sure how long they were going to be retain their oligarchical power, because so much of their power and their wealth depended on their relationship with Putin and those immediately around Putin. Putin, his chief of staff was a guy by the name of Igor Sechin, who went on to become the CEO of Rosneft, which is the largest oil company in Russia. Sechin was in charge of what's known as the Siloviki. Siloviki is Russian for, well, a literal translation is structured force. But essentially what it is in America, we would refer to it in mafia terms, muscle. Siloviki equals muscle. So if Putin wasn't happy with an oligarch, he would sic Sechin's Siloviki on that particular oligarch, and they would just seize the industry or the company and throw the oligarch in jail. And this is what they did with Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who was the head of Yukos Oil, which was the largest oil company at the time. And Putin viewed Khodorkovsky as a competitor, as a rival, as a threat. And so when Putin came in power, became president in 2000, one of the first things he did was just put Khodorkovsky in his place, and threw him in jail, seized his company, and chopped it up and took what he wanted from it. That set a real lesson to all the other oligarchs. They looked around and they saw, if you can do that to Khodorkovsky, you can do it to us. So, they started, trying to get what monies they had in their banks. And in Russia at the time, there were a lot of little banks. They were known as pocket banks because they were in the pocket of the particular industry that the oligarchs would control, whether it was aluminum or oil or whatever. So these banks, are not real banks as we understand them. They're more like, like piggy banks or, that kind of thing. So they would come and go. But anyway, the Russians decided, well, it's time. We need to move our money out of here because what happened to Khodorkovsky could happen to me. So they started doing very complex maneuvers to move it into a large Russian bank that had a correspondent bank relation with banks in Moldova and Latvia. And from there, once you got it into Latvia, you could then move it into the European Union. You could move to the UK. And from the UK, you could go to the British Virgin Islands, Cyprus, or wherever. And they'd use all these shell accounts, masking the identity, the source of ownership. And, they would buy up, make investments in restaurants or athletic teams like, soccer teams, famous soccer teams, basketball teams, hockey teams, whatever. They'd also buy huge yachts, etc. And ultimately, they would end up buying real estate, either commercial real estate or luxury condos in places like London and Manhattan. And they would always buy them in shell company names. The anonymity of real estate purchases that American and UK laws afforded was fully taken advantage of by these oligarchs. When you get to around 2010, the Russian laundromat was basically cracked down. The Moldovan banks, that particular method of money laundering was essentially stopped, and a lot of the Latvian banks closed up.
Once this method of laundering money was shut down, what was next? There's always a new way that would come along to take care of this laundering. What was next?
Another way of moving money had to be devised, and one of those ways was the mirror trades, which emanated from the Deutsche Moscow Bank. And in very simple terms, you can read the articles for the details, but essentially you're talking about an oligarch who has all sorts of, or a corrupt Russian official who has all sorts of accounts both in Russia and outside of Russia, and will set up, devise, or direct various brokers. There's about a dozen brokers in the Moscow area that would be directed to buy Russian stock for, like, let's say, $4 or $5 million, buy stock in, Rosneft or Gazprom or Sberbank or whatever. And at the same time, the oligarch would then direct brokers in London to, sell stock at almost the same exact time as they're buying the $3 or $4 million in Gazprom. There's the London guy is selling 3 or 4 million shares of Gazprom, what the result of that, the simultaneous buying and selling of the same stock for the same price, was to essentially move the Russian rubles that were in hand to London. And at the same time as you're moving it, you are converting it, the Russian term is convert, into euros or dollars, whatever you sold the stock for.
So as these practices went on, what specifically was Deutsche Bank's role as all of these methods continued to evolve?
You say, well, there's real no economic benefit or purpose to this simultaneous. Well, the oligarch has now moved his money out of Russia and converted it from rubles to euros or dollars. And Deutsche's role was they get to collect fees on the trades. And the manager who was in charge of this, a guy named Tim Wiswell, who's an American, and he got paid additional bribes to make sure that no one came in and to protect the traders from this whole thing. And he got $3 or $4 million put into his offshore bank accounts in British Virgin Islands. And this went on for about 4 or 5 years, from 2010 to 2014, 15 area. And we're talking about maybe $10, $11 billion worth of money was moved from Russia, out of Russia, to the UK, and then, from there it could go anywhere. And that's what's known as the Russian mirror trade money laundering scheme that we wrote about here.
You touched on this before, Martin, but were there any consequences with respect to Deutsche Bank? Did anyone care, either in the U.S. or anywhere else in the world?
Now, the UK financial folks hit Deutsche Bank with something like a $650 million fine. The New York State Department of Financial Services hit Deutsche Bank for about a $285 million fine. And the Department of Justice opened up a criminal investigation in the Southern District of New York with regard to Deutsche Bank and these money laundering activities, because a lot of these trades actually pass through the New York bank in terms of the way the financial system is set up. And so that provided New York with venue and jurisdiction. Now, they opened up this investigation a couple of years ago, and it's basically has just lain dormant. And there was a recent article, December, I think CNN put out that they had found that Department of Justice money laundering section, which is located in Washington, had joined the Southern District of New York's prosecutor team in this investigation. But no one could find out just, what is the status of it? And no one really knew. I mean,
I want to come to 1998 and the beginnings of Donald Trump's relationship with Deutsche Bank and how that relationship evolved.
Now, understand, in terms of context, that Donald Trump had, in the 90s, had declared bankruptcy 6 separate times, 1/2 financial bankruptcies, many of which related to the Trump casino in Atlantic City, the Taj Mahal. So he was basically toxic in terms of the rest of the financial industry thinking about providing loans to him. He did not have a good reputation. I want to point out a couple of things there, that the casinos were well known at that time for laundering money. And, the casinos, in fact, did get hit by Treasury Department for money laundering penalties and fines for their lack of anti-money laundering controls. And the other thing I wanted to point out was that as they kept declaring bankruptcy and required them to restructure, the guy that Trump brought in to restructure his organization down there was a guy named Wilbur Ross, who is now Secretary of Commerce. It's late 90s. Trump's having a lot of difficulty with his casinos. He's trying different things, but he decides to get into real estate. He wants to build, a building down at 40 Wall Street. He needs money. The other banks in New York are shying away from him. Deutsche Bank just takes over Bankers Trust. They direct their folks in New York to be aggressive. And being aggressive, as I mentioned earlier, means taking out larger and larger risks. Risk management controls are, negligible at this point. So the decision is made to loan Mr. Trump, quite a bit of money for the 40 Wall Street. That works out fairly well. They continue to loan him money. Mr. Trump builds some more. Deutsche loans more money to him. And it seems to be a good relationship. They're making money. He's making money. The bankers involved are making money. They're making fees. Now, understand that this is Deutsche Bank, their real estate section. They're the ones that know real estate and whatnot. They're doing well with Trump. But then everything's going pretty well until you get to the 2008 area when Trump Tower Chicago, which required, that was like about a $360 million loan, which was $40 million of that was personally guaranteed by Trump. Now, Trump was having difficulty making his payments, and the bank started calling in the note and said, hey, sorry, we've had a good relationship, but you need to, you got to make your payments. And he wasn't doing it. So they sued him. They sued him for the $40 million that he had personally guaranteed, and they took that $40 million. And so what Trump did was he countersued and claimed that, it wasn't his fault he couldn't pay the loan. It was Deutsche Bank's fault for contributing to the worldwide global financial recession, and which is just a crazy suit. That really turned off the real estate executives associated with Deutsche Bank. So they decided after that suit, which Trump lost, and he lost his $40 million that he had personally guaranteed, which he made up real quick by selling this mansion down in Florida to this Russian oligarch called Rybolova, but for like a $50 million profit. But the bankers at Deutsche said, Donald, we're moving you over to the private wealth management section of Deutsche Bank, and Rosemary Vlabik will become your personal wealth manager. And if you want more loans or anything, you deal with her. Vlabik had a real estate background, and she hit it off well with Trump. She was eventually invited to the inauguration. She's also the wealth manager for the Kushners. And of course, that private wealth management section of Deutsche also caters to Russian oligarchs, which isn't real well known. But these private wealth managers are, they're like the guys down, in the hotel lobby that'll run around and do anything you need. Run out and get you the concierge type service. They'll go out and get you, the Broadway ticket, go park your car, or they'll sometimes go buy the car for you. For these wealthy guys, park the yacht, whatever it is. And so, just jumping ahead, if I was a prosecutor for a day in Southern District of New York or on Mueller's team, I would be subpoenaing Rosemary Vlabik as well as the other private wealth managers of Deutsche in New York and asking to see the client list and see if, Rosemary Vlabik had ever introduced any of the oligarchs to Trump and back and forth like that.
As part of your three-part series in Who, What, Why, you give a number of examples of some of the really shady practices and illegal practices in many cases that Deutsche Bank was involved in, so many of which touched on either Trump or the people around Trump. Talk a little bit about one or two of those specific examples.
There was a tax shelter promotion done from 1998 to 2002 that Deutsche Bank was investigated by Southern District of New York and said that, hey, you've sold over 1,000 tax shelters to several thousand people to the tune of close to $6 billion of illegitimate tax losses. And the one percenters, are looking for any reason not to pay their taxes. And if Deutsche Bank didn't provide this service, someone else would have. But in this sense, in this case, Deutsche Bank got caught. They got their wrist slapped. They entered into what's known as an NPA, a non-prosecution agreement with Department of Justice, Southern District of New York, where, they agreed to stop selling, stop promoting these tax shelters, and that if they violated this NPA, that they would be subject to prosecution. The door would be reopened, and this whole issue would be revisited. The same time they were negotiating this, and the negotiation took some time, they began to promote something called basket options. Basket options is basically, it's a financial instrument on the front end where it's a highly leveraged type of deal where you invest not only your money but the bank's money in this case, But the real key to it was on the back end of the transaction is a tax shelter. It would provide for long-term capital gain treatment in lieu of short-term capital gain treatment, which is a savings of approximately half. Now, they sold most of their basket options. I'm talking Deutsche Bank came up with these basket options. They sold most of them to Renaissance Technology, or otherwise known as Rentech. The co-CEO of Rentech is probably the best-known person associated with Rentech. His name is Robert Mercer. He's what I would refer to as an American oligarch because in 2016 he made political contributions of approximately $20 million. Rentech also ran a company called Cambridge Analytica, which employed Steve Bannon, Kellyanne Conway, and they were involved in doing analytics with regard to how to sway potential voters out in the country.
What exactly was Rentech, and how did it specifically benefit from Deutsche Bank?
Renaissance Technology is a hedge fund, the second largest hedge fund in this country. And what they would do is a lot of their trades were computer-generated based on the very complex algorithms devised by their very highly educated folks. And they would engage in thousands, sometimes millions of trades inside of a couple of seconds. So that means buying and selling a financial product inside of a couple of seconds. Seconds, nanoseconds even. Well, to qualify for a long-term capital gain treatment, which is much less than a short-term capital gain treatment tax-wise, you have to hold, when you buy a financial instrument, you have to hold it for at least 1 year before you sell it. And that's what's called long-term capital gain. Anything over a year is long-term. Anything under a year is short-term. Well, Renaissance Technology was treating all these hundreds, thousands, sometimes millions of transactions that occurred in nanoseconds. They were treating that as if they were long-term. They were held long-term. They couldn't be a more gross violation of tax treatment. There's no confusion as to that these products were held for a year. They were held for seconds. So that allowed Renaissance Technology to qualify for what's tax savings that has been what's publicly been announced as $6.8 billion. I've seen other places say $7 billion of tax savings were derived by Rentech through the use of these basket options. Now, the U.S. Senate Permanent Committee for Investigations, headed by ex-Senator Carl Levin, investigated this, and they brought in testimony. They brought in Deutsche Bank executives, et cetera. And, after all was said and done, Senator Levin characterized these basket options as let's pretend basket options, basically calling them like a magical device, that just magically transformed, a sale that occurred, a buy and sell transaction that occurred in seconds to something that took over a year, and allowing them to take long-term capital gain. So here you have, the IRS said back in 2010, these basket options serve no economic purpose. There is nothing to them. There is no substance to it. Do not use these basket options. Rentech continues to use them. Rentech buys at least 29 of these basket options. Deutsche Bank was told back in the middle 2000s, do not sell any tax shelters. Do not engage in any more promotion of tax shelters. And even as they're signing that agreement, they're selling these basket options to Rentech in clear violation of their non-prosecution agreement. Why did they do it? There's only one reason, and that has to do with money. They were making huge fees on the sale of these basket options. Southern District of New York prosecuted KPMG in the mid-2000s for the sale. KPMG, of course, also one of the biggest accounting firms in the country. They were selling illegal tax shelters. They got prosecuted, and they entered into what's known as a deferred prosecution agreement. Of course, nobody goes to jail. But if you read the DPA, the deferred prosecution agreement, KPMG could not have conducted their tax shelter scheme without interacting with a bank. And as it turns out, even in the indictment, the bank that was involved was called Bank A in the indictment. Bank A, as it turns out, is Deutsche Bank. My feeling is that a chief executive of Deutsche Bank should be held responsible for all these financial shenanigans, because not only were the shareholders of Deutsche Bank ripped off, American taxpayers and, Russian taxpayers were ripped off, and it was done at the direction of centralized management. And centralized management in this instance is the CEO of Deutsche Bank. Now, for a good long period of time, the CEO was a guy by the name of Joseph Ackerman. Joseph Ackerman left in around, somewhere between 2012 2014 to become the president or head of Bank of Cyprus, which is it's the largest bank in Cyprus. Cyprus is a known tax haven, money laundering area in the world, and a place where many of the Russians, the oligarchs and corrupt officials, park a lot of their money. And in fact, Paul Manafort had opened up something like 15 accounts at the bank that preceded Bank of Cyprus. Bank of Cyprus took it over. So, it's a small world here. You have wealthy folks in America, wealthy folks in the UK, and wealthy folks in Russia, all benefiting from the financial irregularities, if you want to say, or even the financial criminal conduct of Deutsche Bank, who's in the pursuit of earnings and executive bonuses.
You also have a pretty strong relationship between the Kushner family and Deutsche Bank.
Oh, yeah. Even Kushner's mother has a account with the private wealth section of Deutsche Bank. Kushner himself has an open line of credit to the tune of, $5 to $10 million with Deutsche Bank, and as well as Ivanka. But Kushner, his company obtained loans to the tune of approximately $285 million from Deutsche Bank 1 month prior to the November election. And this is during a period of time where Deutsche Bank was negotiating, how much of a fine they would pay on their the toxic mortgage loan exposure they had, and it was $14.2 billion was the figure that Southern District of New York first floated. That got cut to literally in half to $7 billion right after the president got elected. And this is, perhaps it was coincidental that Kushner, who also had financial issues of his own, perhaps it was, just coincidental that Deutsche Bank gave him such a huge loan, and that they had their $7 billion savings on the fine. So Kushner has these loans going on. It should be noted, and I think I note that in the article, that Deutsche Bank and Vnesh Ekonobank is a bank in Russia that Putin and the oligarchs make quite a bit of use of. Web and Deutsche had a cooperation agreement. A lot of times, Russian oligarchs, particularly right around the recession time, they got overextended, and Deutsche made some loans which were in peril. Web would come in and save the day with emergency loans, bridge loans, and whatnot. So they have a long history of working together. And eventually, Kushner met with the president of VEB early December. And the president of VEB was a guy named Sergei Gorkov, who is ex-FSB and closely tied to Vladimir Putin. And, we don't know what was discussed there, but we do know that a month later, Eric Prince, who was a brother of Betsy DeVos, the Secretary of Education, he met with some Russians, financiers, bankers, as well as a sheikh from Qatar. They all met out in the Seychelles Islands, which is another bank secrecy haven. And they also met with a guy who heads the Russian Development Fund, which is run by or supervised by VEB. Both the Russian Development Fund and VEB are under sanctions. So you have just one meeting after another that between members of Kushner's, I should say Trump's close circle, whether it's Flynn, Kushner, Prince, and folks who are under and institutions that are under economic sanctions.
It's interesting that there's the assumption with all of this that somehow Trump is the center of this universe, but in fact Deutsche Bank really is the center of the universe, and everything revolves around that. The Russians, Trump, all these other banks, I mean, they really are the center of this story. Deutsche
is the common thread. If you want to do anything in terms of investments, tax maneuvers, you basically need a big financial institution. If you're a mover and shaker financially, you're going to have be accommodated by a bank who can facilitate movement of money worldwide. I mean, it's a global economy now. You hit a button and you've moved money from one side of the globe to the other. So, you need banks to do that, and there are banks who will do anything for a price, for a fee, and certainly Deutsche was one of those. And why wouldn't they? I mean, no one has been prosecuted, so there's no deterrence.
With respect to Deutsche Bank, we've certainly heard that Mueller has subpoenaed documents from Deutsche Bank. How legitimate do you think Deutsche Bank will be in providing the documentation that Mueller's people want?
That's a great question. Don't know. And we can't even be sure that Mueller's people are the ones that subpoenaed Deutsche Bank records. And let me tell you why. You have, Mueller certainly has his investigation, which emanates out of Washington, D.C., okay? But the subpoenas that I've heard about came most recently out of the Eastern District of New York, which is Brooklyn, the Department of the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Eastern District. I don't know that sounds like a separate investigation to me, looking into Kushner.
Martin, we're just about out of time. If you look at the totality of this story and everything that you've written about Deutsche Bank, how would you sum this all up?
My feeling is that Deutsche Bank has engaged in, for years, the facilitation of tax evasion by wealthy people, whether it's facilitating money laundering and mirror trades for wealthy Russian oligarchs, or by engaging in the sale and promotion of tax shelters for wealthy Americans. They've been heavily engaged in doing that. That's just one more service that Deutsche Bank has provided, with little consideration as to the fact that they may well have entered into tax evasion or actually committing crimes in servicing their clients.
Martin Sheil, I thank you so much for spending time with us today.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Jeff. Anytime.
Thank you. And thank you for listening and for joining us here on Radio Who, What, Why. I hope you join us next week for another Radio Who, What, Why podcast. I'm Jeff Sheckman. If you like this podcast, please feel free to share and help others find it by rating and reviewing it on iTunes. You can also support this podcast and all the work we do by going to whowhatwhy.org kushners.com/donate.